All right. We will wait till we see people file in.
Wait 1 sec. Jim, I need permission to record it. There we go.
There's nobody here. That's weird.
Here they come.
Oh, there we go. All right. We'll just chit chat here for a second while people stream in, because I don't want people to miss everything. If somebody in the chat could do me a solid and just put the Phillies game on in another window and give me scoring updates when they happen, that would be much appreciated. I would consider that a service to the Bulwark. And I want to say, before I introduce our panelists for the night, we're talking about very serious stuff tonight, and I was a little upset at some of the people in the comments on the newsletter today, and I got my dad voice on. I don't want to get upset with anybody in the comments here in the chat. Be your best selves. Lead with compassion. Lead with kindness. Don't act badly tonight, or I will have Jim pull the car over. Okay. All right. That said, reminder, keep your chat settings set to everyone if you want people to be able to see you. And with that noted, welcome to Thursday Night Bulwark. I'm JVL, and joined today by probably the most high power panel we've ever had. Ben Parker of the Bulwark. Gave him first billing. See that, Mono? Bill Kristol of the Bulwark. Eric Edelman, not of the Bulwark, but really kind of the Bulwark, from our Shield of the Republic podcast, which is one of my favorite podcasts, maybe my favorite podcast, certainly my favorite weekly podcast. Everybody should listen to it. Also, senior non-resident fellow at the Miller Center. Do I have that right, Eric?
That's correct. Yeah.
And a very, very old friend of mine, Tom Joscelyn, who has been all over the place and everywhere, currently is a senior fellow at the Reiss Center. I don't think Tom and I have seen each other since 2018. It's been a long time, but it's good to have you here, buddy. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
First, does anybody care? Just moments ago, Steve Scalise has pulled out, and he is not going to be the speaker. Surprise, surprise. That's kind of interesting. Does anybody here? Well, we'll make very quickly. Bill, do you have any thoughts?
No, he says he's going to stay as majority leader, and I don't know whether there's some. I don't know. There could be some deal that's been cooked for some interim speaker who's acceptable. But it's hard to see who would be acceptable to the entire conference. I have who knows what will happen. I think all bets are off, and people who I've been pushing the notion that 5 Republicans should vote for Jeffries, reserve their right to vote against legislation, have the Democrats organize the House, pass the big supplemental for Israel, Ukraine, and the border, keep the government open, and then they can rethink everything if they want, even in January. That's not the way the government's usually worked in the US, and it probably won't happen. But it makes me think that just generally, all kinds of things could happen that we don't expect to happen right at this point. Discharge petitions, interim speakers, shared speakership, but conceivably a lot of things could happen that we're not used to.
Nancy Mesa speaker? Is that in the cards?
That would be something, huh?
No. Okay.
To complete the transition of the U.S. from a serious country to a Marx Brothers movie,
Okay. There ends the candy. Everything else from here on out is spinach, guys. So last Saturday morning, we all woke up to the deadliest attack in Israel since the Yom Kippur War? Is that right? More Jews killed in a single day than any day since the Holocaust, I think.
Yeah.
Absolutely horrific. Either an intelligence failure on the Israelis' part or an intelligence success on the part of Hamas, or maybe a little bit of both. Israel has started operations to begin its retaliation. I don't know if we have a stated goal of being the removal of Hamas, but it feels like that probably is the actual military and political goal here. I guess I just want to go around the horn very quickly and give me your 30 or 45-second thoughts on the state of play of where we are now. And let's start with you, Eric.
Well, the Israelis have obviously been carrying out air operations in Gaza, striking at Hamas infrastructure, headquarters, other facilities associated with it. 6,000 bombs in 6 days. That is a lot of ordnance to be dropping. They're also massing forces, and we have every reason to believe that they will go in underground for at least some period of time. That will be a very messy, very bloody operation, urban warfare. And Tom can talk about this with greater expertise than I, but is one of the toughest kinds of warfare. I think the big thing that everybody's watching and concerned about is, does this expand beyond Gaza? Do we get a northern front of both Lebanon and Syria? Do we see a uprising on the West Bank, which Hamas has been calling for? And does that then precipitate Israeli direct action against Iran? So we could be looking ultimately at potentially a 5-front war, if you will.
Oh God. Tom, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, just to echo what Eric said about the bomb rate. I mean, 6,000 bombs in several days. That's a far greater use of ordnance than the U.S. at its max capacity fighting ISIS or the Taliban in Afghanistan. So just to give you a sense of the scale of the bombing campaign in Gaza, clearly, I think they're paving the way for something greater here in the near future. We're all anticipating a ground invasion. I really do wonder what the end game is that they envision, because this is very tricky. It's one thing to say you're going to go after Hamas's capabilities. It's quite another to say you're going to try and actually destroy the organization and uproot it. Those are two very different things. And you kind of see a little bit of mixed messaging from the Israelis. When I listen to some of the officials, they say we're going to destroy Hamas. Others say we're going to destroy Hamas's capabilities. So I'm really keeping an eye on what are actually the goals of the coming operation. And to echo one other thing that Eric said, I was looking back at the reporting we've had over the last few years, going back to 2021. And one of the things that's very striking is that Iran has really built up the capacity of terrorist organizations on 4 fronts to come after Israel. So you're talking about Gaza, West Bank, Syria, and Lebanon. And really that is, from the jihadi or the Iranian backside of the terrorist perspective, that really is the big open question on their side. What's going to be the next move for them?
Ben?
Yeah, I think the trickiest thing here is if you put yourself, if you imagine that you were the prime minister of Israel right now, you're in a terrible situation of needing to tell your people that, we're not going to allow this to happen again, right? That this is unacceptable, and we need to do something to ensure that this isn't a thing that can just happen again in a couple of years, which means basically eliminating Hamas as a threat, which means a ground invasion of Gaza. Which either means that's not a goal you can accomplish, or you accomplish it and then you end up in control of Gaza. And we are right back where the Israelis were in 2004, the year before they decided to pull out of Gaza and throw up their hands. And it's not that dissimilar from where the US found itself in 2004 in Iraq, where it's like, great, you've deposed the problem, you've gotten rid of it, and now what? And, it's not clear to me that this is a problem that anyone wants. Egypt has closed its border with Hamas for decades. They don't want to have Gaza as their responsibility. It's not clear the Palestinian Authority that governs the West Bank wants Hamas, wants Gaza as its responsibility, especially in the way it's going to be after a ground invasion. So it's like, there are no good options here. We can hope that post invasion or post operation, something emerges that is better than this, because it's hard to be worse than this, but it might just be the same.
Bill, so that's a pretty dark view that Ben just gave us. It sounds pretty right to me, but also it's weirdly the best case option, because it also means that we don't have a wider war, right? As bad as what Ben just spelled out is, that presupposes that we don't also have Iran in direct conflict and Syria and Lebanon, right, and the West Bank. Are there any good outcomes on the table here, or are we really just looking at what is the least horrible scenario?
Well, with wars, it's always, it's all scenarios are bad, obviously. So it makes sense in a way to be pessimistic and not ebullient or something, which no one is, obviously, in this case, especially after the ghastly events of last weekend. I would just say a couple of things. Wars are unpredictable. The actual course of wars are famously unpredictable, but also the implications and effects of wars on international politics, but also on domestic politics in different countries are unpredictable. So we have a certain view of Gaza. If Hamas doesn't run it, it could be just chaos. But I don't know. Is it impossible to clean out the Gaza, the Hamas leadership, and get some international help and imagine a somewhat more satisfactory solution a year from now, even after casualties on both sides and a lot of destruction and death? I don't mean to minimize that in Gaza, but I would come back to the point I guess Eric and Tom made in particular, the risks of a wider war, and no one's mentioned the U.S. I mean, we have hostages in there. I mean, is it if we thought we could get them out, or if we thought they were going to be killed, would U.S. special operations teams? I don't even want to speculate too much on this, because I don't know anything. Let me be clear, so I'm not trying to, but I feel even bad to speculating about it. But go in. I mean, could we be in conflict? What if Iran turns out to be giving much more direct help to Hamas as they're holding American citizens hostages? I mean, I think what if Russia is sort of doing more than we think? I don't know that they are, and I don't want to be one of those who, in a sort of paranoid way, says, "Oh, it's Iran calling every shot or Russia calling every shot." I don't believe that, or certainly not with Russia, probably not with Iran calling every shot. But still, as Tom said, they've certainly beefed up the terrorist entities they either control, like Hezbollah, or have strong relations with, like Hamas. So I think there's all kinds of wild cards here. And I think it's probably one mistake would be to assume there's necessarily going to be some kind of replay of the previous Israel-Gaza incursions into Gaza, which have had terrible dilemmas and consequences on their own. Obviously, this Israeli domestic political consequences. I just think it's really the rest of the Arab world, the Saudis, the Egyptians. I mean, all kinds of things could get triggered one way or the other by side effects of this. But the hostages is really one wild card. A terrible thing, of course, but as well. But that makes it a little different,
Oh, JV,
Eric, talk to me a little bit about the hostages.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in to say on that point, I think the Israelis have done something actually quite smart, which is, they've cut off the water and the electricity to Gaza. That's led to a lot of outcry from Palestinians in Gaza, of course, but also some members of the international community saying, "Oh, this is really terrible." And the Israelis have said, "Give us our hostages back, and then we'll turn the water and electricity back on." And that is, I think, put the monkey on Hamas's back where it ought to be, with regard to the release of the hostages. So and it's taken off the table the question of, "Oh, well, you can't do anything militarily to us." And I think that was a very smart thing to do.
Tom, can you talk to me a little bit about the Iranian connection here? We had the Wall Street Journal report right off the bat saying that Iran was neck deep in all of this. There seems to have been some doubt about the reporting on this and some questions on it. I imagine all of this is shades of gray, because it's impossible to imagine this attack without some Iranian involvement. And so we're really just negotiating about, well, how significant was it? Can you speak to this for us?
Yeah, I think that's right. I was going to yield to Tom, but I wanted to say one thing about it, which is you may have seen some stories that suggest that the intelligence community is saying the Iranian leadership was taken by surprise by the timing. No one should regard that as dispositive evidence one way or the other about the Iranian role, because one can imagine a very deep Iranian role without knowing specifically the timing.
Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, what I find curious about all this is it's really simple, right? The Israelis were caught off guard. The U.S. was caught off guard by this. And then within a matter of days, you have reporting or guesswork about what was known by the Iranians beforehand, right? We don't know what the Iranians knew beforehand. If we had really good intelligence on that, there would have been warnings to stop it, right? So this idea that sort of the Israelis have, incredibly effective intelligence service, that's been knocked down a few pegs by what we've seen here. And nobody should think that the American intelligence services are omniscient and have all this perfect insight into the Iranians or anybody else. It's far from it, And so I don't think we actually know what the Iranians knew or didn't know beforehand. But in general, Hamas, has been, I was thinking about this back in the old Weekly Standard days, going way back when. I wrote a piece about how Hamas was sending this stream of officials to Tehran, over a course of a year. And you could point to that kind of relationship, which is very organic at this point between the two, going back a very long time. This you're talking about every imaginable sort of material support you can imagine the Iranians have provided to Hamas. So would I be surprised if in the future we learn that the Iranians knew more than we think right now, or that some people in intelligence we think now? I wouldn't be surprised at all. And the other thing is, just go to Khamenei's Twitter feed, right, and look what he was saying in the weeks leading up to this. And anybody looking at that should say, wait a minute, this is a guy who is clearly advocating for exactly this, openly, on X, formerly known as Twitter. Why should we assume that he didn't know what was coming? So I think, we'll learn more in the future, but I think everybody should now be disabused of the notion that the Israelis have perfect intelligence or the Americans have, perfect intelligence on top of stuff. Truth is, neither one of them do.
I've been sort of obsessed with the question of Hamas's intelligence capabilities being much more sophisticated than we think. We tend to want to blame our side, thinking that we should always win, right? But on the other hand, putting together an operation like this with the number of guys you got to train, just the physical weight and volume of supplies that you've got to both procure and then hide and then disseminate leading up to it. There's going to be financial records. I mean, so you imagine they're not just hiding this, they're also painting some sort of counterintelligence picture, right? I mean, they're doing their own counter intel operations to try to distract their opponents, us and the Israelis. And that seems like they were more sophisticated than a lot of people assumed. No?
Two things.
Can I just add one thing on that? I mean, the places they attacked Israel proper. They didn't attack the West Bank, which is a partial military governance. Israel proper is an open society. I mean, right. You can go to any of these kibbutzes near 500 meters from Gaza as a tourist. You can go as an Israeli. You can go as an Israeli Arab who, 98% of whom are not, 99.9%, let's hope, are not involved in any kind of consorting with terrorists. But they also have relatives who they don't tell something. It wouldn't be hard to discover that these are peaceful kibbutzes that are, full of well-intentioned people, decent people living lives and down there right by Gaza, assuming that the fence will hold and the barrier will hold. And they know they're a little more risk than they're from the middle of the country, but not expecting anything like this. So I agree with your point about the other aspects of intelligence, which are more, interesting and serious in a sense of when they timed it and how they might have jammed some Israeli communications. So the military didn't hear about it as quickly as they might have. But it is worth reminding, it's the same way we're vulnerable to terrorism. This is not, you can come to the US and check out how flights, pre 9/11, what the security is on commercial flights and which ones are flying where and what's a more vulnerable airport. And they could, in effect, do the same thing for Israel, tragically.
Well, can I add a point to that? Just to buttress what you're saying, Bill. One of the Telegram feeds that I follow on this from the Southern Defense Forces for Israel has been putting out documents captured, allegedly or reportedly captured from the terrorists who did this. And some of the evidence that they're, publishing, which of course hasn't been, thoroughly vetted at this point, but seems credible, shows exactly what you're talking about. Where what they did was with one of the kibbutz in particular, they did surveillance on it. They took, they took measure of the place. They figured out how it operated, how the security operated, who was around, how many people were there. And according to some of the documents that have come out, show that about a year ago, they made the plans to actually attack and show, and they divided up in a squad. Now, none of this is super sophisticated, right? But it does show a level of foreplanning and intent way in advance of the actual attack that is noteworthy. Second thing I would say real quick on this is that what I was struck by as somebody who's consumed an unfortunate amount of jihadi media through the years was how much of they were ready to have the propaganda war, fight the media war here. They had a lot of propaganda ready to go. Everything from, constructing the paragliders and practicing and getting ready with them to, building the rocket launchers and getting ready to GoPros that were on a lot of the different terrorists who went into these different residential areas to even a 7-hour live stream on Facebook showing the actual attack. So they had a very, it's, again, not a high level of sophistication to do this day and age, but they were ready to go for the media war, which is very important in all this from their perspective,
There are two other things that were at work here, I think, and Tom, I'd be very interested in your reaction to this. First of all, it does appear that Hamas was engaged in much better operational security than they have traditionally been involved in. So the Israelis were not picking up anything on SIGINT or communications intelligence chatter on cell phones that would have given away some of the planning of this. And the second thing is Reuters had a very good story 2 days ago about the very sophisticated deception and denial operation that the Hamas folks were engaged in. They went to great lengths to convince the government of Israel, particularly the intelligence services, that they weren't interested in another round. They'd had enough after 2007 and 8 and 2014 and 2021, didn't want to fight again, wanted to sort of focus on economic development of Gaza, get more work permits for Gazans to come to the West Bank or into Israel proper to work and remit money to help boost the Gazan economy. And, this is one of those things where on the Shield podcast, Eliot Cohen said, it's always easier to have an influence operation if people want to believe what you're trying to get them to believe. And so for Israeli officials who, obviously would much prefer to believe that this was happening in Gaza than, what did happen, you can see them falling for this very easily.
100%. If I follow up on that real quick, I have a very speculative answer on the why their operational security was better or wasn't detected by Israelis. My sense of looking at what we now know about publicly about the operatives who led the actual attack is, I think, and this again very speculative, is that what we may be seeing here is a younger generation of Hamas that the Israeli intelligence services were not as familiar with, and that they knew the older generation of Hamas better and had better sources and better spies and that kind of thing in it. And you've even seen a smattering of reports saying that some of the older generation of Hamas was cut out of the planning for this, was cut out of the works of this. And why is that all important? Well, one of the reasons why Gaza is such a thorny situation is you're talking about, and JVL, you're going to love, I think you'll like this point because you've been obsessed with demographics for so long. There are very few places, as you know, on the planet where the birth rates are increing, right?
As young as God, right? The median age there was like 15.
Exactly, right. And if you look at the data on the demographics of the three of the places where they're the youngest and the birth rates are increasing the fastest, they're actually all jihadi hotspots. So you had Afghanistan, Pakistan, where the Taliban, Al Qaeda, and ISIS are thriving, and the Taliban, Al Qaeda overthrew the government. You have West Africa, where the jihadis there are about to overthrow, the government establishments there in the military, and you have Gaza. That's one of the top three, and Gaza skews very, very young, and to me, that speaks to most likely you're dealing with a new generation of Hamas here.
I'd just like to add one more point to this intelligence failure, which is, you were talking about this on the Shield podcast, which I listened to today, but to a certain extent, there's intelligence failures and operational successes, right? And so the old joke is that the people who are actually in charge of making decisions can always blame the intelligence. But we have what looks to me like multiple independent sources reporting that the Egyptians gave the Israelis a tip and said, hey, it looks like something's coming in Gaza. You guys might want to, check this out. A few days is not a ton of time to prepare, but it's enough to get people from the West Bank back to Gaza, right? To get some of the Gaza division back from the West Bank where they've been, moved from their station location. And that's not an intelligence failure. That's just a policy-making failure. That's just the Israeli leadership dropping the ball. And that's going to be on Bibi's shoulders.
So I want to go into that a little bit. First, Carl, thank you for your service. You're a great American. Sorry, Carl is giving me updates from the Phillies game in the comments. I greatly appreciate it. So how much stock do we put in that story? When that came out, I think it was yesterday or the day before, I just thought to myself, wow, this is, A, all too believable because this is how governments work. But B, also, it seems awfully convenient and seems like the kind of thing that would confirm a lot of our priors.
I don't think, JVL, we're going to know for a while. But one thing about the Israelis is that they are incredibly introspective and self-critical. And, we know that after the intelligence failure in 1973, they had a major commission, the Agranat Commission, which, named names, held people responsible, led to major changes, not only in the intelligence services and the military, but Israeli politics. the same thing happened after Sabra and Shatila in 1982. Same thing happened after 2006 Lebanon war with the Vinegrad Commission. So they will go through this. We will know in the fullness of time kind of exactly what happened and, who screwed up and who didn't. The only thing I would say about this Egyptian report is it's certainly consistent with the idea of people believing what they want to believe and discarding those things that are inconvenient, that they don't want to believe. So it's perfectly plausible from that point of view. But the other thing I've learned in these kinds of situations, I suspect Bill from his experience in government knows the same thing as does Tom. Early reports are, frequently wrong. And so everything, that's coming out needs to be treated with an excessive degree of caution.
I'll just say, just to argue with myself, right? We also don't know the broader context. Like maybe the Egyptians send the Israelis one of these things a week, right? And so they're actually not useful. So, there's more context we definitely need to learn. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just say the people I've spoken with in Israel are very familiar with Israel. I do think are struck, though. I mean, we had very dysfunctional Israeli politics for the last year and a very dysfunctional society in some way caused by the politics. I put most of the blame for that on Netanyahu and his government, but others could differ. And some of the ministries being run by people who really don't know anything. And therefore, Netanyahu himself can't do everything and maybe didn't want to. He was also distracted by a million different things. And so I think the degree to which it would make sense that a piece of information like that might not get treated as seriously in the government we had for the last year as before that. People I've talked to are very upset by this apparent slowness of reaction of the IDF. People got in their cars and drove south, and this wonderful story of the father who helped rescue his family before the soldiers got there. That is not the tradition in Israel, which has been very proud of incredibly quick. Now, it's a small force, and if they have to mobilize reserves, that takes a little longer. So on the one hand, but people are upset about that. And I think that, therefore, I think the degree to which the warnings that the military wasn't, the disruption in the society had spilled a little bit into maybe the military command or relations between civilian commanders in the military, and then it was Shabbat, it was Saturday morning, it was a holiday as well, and what would normally take to happen much more quickly if everyone's in the office at 9:15 a.m. or even coming into the office at 7 a.m. Doesn't happen as quickly if people are hard to get, and some of them it's not an excuse. But on the other hand, I would say, just on the flip side of that, as someone who's been to Israel a few times and admires the society and the country, I mean, it's the mobilization, the speed with which everyone has rallied, putting the incredibly bitter political divisions, which were comparable to ours, really, putting them totally behind them in 1 day, 2 days. And now people who were denounced by Netanyahu's most radical right-wing ministers as vermin because they were protesting against what was happening there. People who were saying, this is was maybe a little foolish, that they would, not even fulfill their reserve duty, have all volunteered or all rushing to the front. It sounds like the military, again, has not done a great job. This is hard to tell because people always complain, of course, in getting some of the material and other things there. And it reminds me of some of our things in the U.S. too. Reminds me a little of early COVID. People have been going to store. I know an email from someone who lives there. Been going to stores and using Amazon and stuff to buy things for their kids or husbands or many others, friends, neighbors, who are going to the front because the military, doesn't have everything. Now, to be fair, you're mobilizing 300,000 people at once, which would be the equivalent in the U.S. of 10 million people. You're not going to have like 10 million of everything right sitting in some warehouse if you don't expect it to have happened. So I do think there is some general, sort of fits into what Tom and others were talking about, what Eliot Cohen said. Eric reported Eliot Cohen. The general sense was there was not going to have to be this kind of effort, this size effort, this urgent kind of effort in the near future. People were pretty hopeful. It had been a pretty good few years of disturbances on the West Bank, but nothing, remotely approaching this scale. What Jake Sullivan said 2 weeks ago, which will haunt him for a long time. The Middle East is quiet. I don't have to spend nearly as much time on it as my predecessors did. I can focus on China and on Ukraine, obviously, and all that, which looks terrible after the fact, sort of not so understandable before that. I think there was a little bit of that attitude in Israel itself in a funny way. We're focused on everything but the actual possibility from Gaza, especially. And there, I think the disinformation campaign was very effective. They really did seem to have convinced senior parts of the Israeli government that they were not interested in picking another fight with Israel, that there were disturbances on the West Bank. You have to worry about the north with Hezbollah. Gaza was sore. It was bad, but it was not going to blow up. So the combination of all those things meant, on the one hand, the Israeli government and military, I would say, performed badly by their own standards in the run-up and in the first day. But Israeli society has really performed impressively, it seems to me, over these last few days.
There's an
American
asymmetry
society
here.
would not have performed this well. I think we can all agree, right? We would have immediately devolved into, we would have had a third of the country
Finger
with
pointing.
conspiracy.
Yeah, this is more like we were after
conspiracy
9/11.
theories
Yeah.
And maybe it's a sad thing if we're not confident that we would be that way again today, which I don't know.
There's
Right.
an asymmetry here that Hamas, I think, exploited, which was, Israel is startup nation, very high tech, and the Israelis, I think, overestimated their ability to deal with this issue with technology. So they built this very sophisticated system, to keep terrorists out of Israel from Gaza, with sensors and drones flying around, automated machine guns, and Hamas, understood that this was an Achilles heel in a sense, because there was not as much human eyes on the problem, and they were able to, with a combination of cyber attacks that disrupted the communication among the drones and from the drones back to the observation posts. They were able to disable the cameras, with quadcopters dropping grenades on the observation towers. So the Israelis thought they'd put these huge barriers underground so they couldn't tunnel, and they created this fence, and Hamas flew over the fence and disabled the sensors and went around it, because they were focused on people, not on technology. And I think the Israelis, their strength became a weakness here.
Yeah, we're really in the sour spot for AI. AI is not helpful enough to be able to actually solve problems like security, but is absolutely strong enough to help authoritarian regimes suppress their own people. It's really great. Can we talk a little bit about Hezbollah and Iran? Because this is one of the, it's strange to talk about it because it's just sort of looming out there and we don't know. How concerned are you guys about this war widening? And if it widened, does it serve anybody's interests? Because that's the real right. Does anybody benefit if this widens up? And I don't know. I'll start with you, Ben. I get the sense Iran is very, very hot to make sure that Saudi Arabia doesn't come to any sort of accord with Israel. So a wider war would make that even more difficult. No.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about the principal agent relationships here. Part of me thinks, based on no specific knowledge, that like if Hezbollah were part of this, they would be part of it already. And if Iran were really pulling the strings, they would have pulled all of them. And what's the point of not? Hezbollah is sitting on a missile arsenal that makes Hamas's look puny by comparison. We thought at the beginning of the Korean War that this was actually, Stalin pulling the strings and it was the massive international communist conspiracy. It turns out it was actually, more like Kim Il-sung, who was playing Moscow and Beijing off of each other. It was mostly his idea, and they both kind of had to support him a little bit. Of course, the Chinese had supported him a lot more later. The point being, Hezbollah, is definitely a proxy of Iran, but isn't Iran. And I'm sure Tom knows much more about this than I do. But they definitely have some of their own interests here, and there's a reason that they appear to be staying out, and I just don't know exactly what that is.
Tom, what do you think?
We don't know what the calculation is, so we got to be really careful here. I mean, one of the things is that Israel hasn't even started the ground operation, at least as when we started this webinar tonight. and you could imagine scenarios where they want Israel to get mired in the conflict Eric was talking about, this urban warfare, and then unleash Hezbollah, right? I mean, that's a scenario that's very plausible as we sit here on a Thursday evening. So I'm not saying it's going to happen. I don't know. I don't think we really know. I mean, a lot of times what I found when we analyze these groups and their patrons is we don't really know all the variables in their calculation. We only see one or two of them, and they may have five, and so we don't really understand exactly everything they're thinking about. What I try and do, though, is look at what the terrorists are saying and their sponsors are saying, and for clues. And you don't accept it at face value, but they do give you certain hints, right? And you have Hamas officials going out there talking about how they have been consulting with Iran and Turkey and Russia and others, right? Well, that's indicative of some ongoing dialogue there with their patrons and sponsors, right? And who knows what exactly is being said in those conversations. So to your latter question about who benefits from a wider war, you can certainly envision scenarios, right, where Russia benefits from a wider war, because basically there's even less attention on Ukraine. Eric's going to know this much better than I do. It's much more of a question, but, I don't know what our industrial capacity is right now for producing arms for Ukraine and for Israel. But if you start splitting our needs, right, on a constrained capacity, well, that becomes a problem, could become a problem pretty quickly. So I think there are a lot of different variables here that our enemies are calculating, and we don't even know all of them. And I don't want to assume that they aren't there,
That's such an important point. And I want to make the general version of it and then let Eric, who actually knows infinitely more about this, talk about it, and I'm sure in more detail. But this is sort of there are known unknowns, and then there are unknown unknowns. And to quote from Rumsfeld, and I think the unknown unknowns here are very ripe. I mean, who knows what they think? Look, some of them want to destroy Israel. Some of them want to weaken the U.S. as much as possible at all costs, and they don't care how many innocent people get killed in the course of that. If you have those two priorities, to weaken Israel, and let's just say weaken instead of destroy, but really weaken and shatter their confidence and exacerbate their domestic problems, and weaken us at a time when we don't look so healthy, and where half of the party that controls the House of Representatives seems to want to get out of helping Ukraine. It isn't generally very serious about our international responsibilities. I don't know, a really bloody war that stretches out with Israel, with some U.S. involvement and hostages, and then Russia suddenly will do something, maybe. How do we know, right? In Ukraine or elsewhere. I mean, I do think the degree that there's a tendency to underestimate. Let's hope none of this happens. And it's it's already terrible, but it's a manageable, terrible situation. But the degree to which things can spin out of control, either purposely or semi-purposely, or some people have a purpose for it to spin out of control. Other people are saying, well, wait a second, I'm not so sure I'm for that. But you know what? If the IRGC decides to go ahead, and I don't know, have a terror attack on a U.S. base in the Middle East, and thinks it's a pretty good time to maybe convince everyone there to get the U.S. to get out of there. Why are there 11,000 U.S. soldiers there in Qatar? And let's just get them, let's really increase the isolationist America First sentiment and rattle everyone here and weaken the Biden administration. And Putin wouldn't be unhappy about that. So there could be some assistance. Maybe something would happen elsewhere in Europe. I mean, I just think the degree to which these bad guys aren't, I won't even mention China, they all get a vote. And once these things start and it becomes an unstable situation, not an equilibrium, one vote I'm mixing 8 metaphors here, but one vote in an unstable situation, one act in an unstable situation, then creates other acts that are, in an unstable situation. And I think it's a very worrisome moment.
So a couple of points. One, to build on what Tom and Ben and Bill have been saying. Number one, I think if this goes bigger, it goes very big. It's hard to imagine, if this starts to escalate, that it doesn't become a very big war in the region. Ben was talking about Hezbollah's missile and rocket arsenal. It's estimated in open sources at 150,000 rockets and missiles. Hamas just in the first few days was on the verge of overwhelming the David Sling and Iron Dome system that Israel has with 5,000 of these things. 150,000 will definitely overwhelm Israeli integrated air and missile defenses and wreak just enormous devastation and danger. This is one reason why I think the Israelis are, trying very hard to message to both Iran and Hezbollah, and President Biden is as well, don't go there, don't do this. By the same token, Hezbollah has a big calculation to make as well. I mean, the last time they got into this with Israel in 2006, Israel, even though its ground operations, were halting at first and not executed very well, they did wreak enormous damage on Hezbollah. They killed a lot of Hezbollah fighters and really devastated their capabilities for a number of years. And whether they want to bite that off again and deal with that, it's not at all clear. Even if Iran would want them, to go, whether they would actually, want to do that. If Hezbollah lets loose, it's very hard for me to believe that Israel doesn't carry this fight to Iran. They may do it in any event, because after what's happened last weekend, Israelis, I'm sure, are having conversations about what happens when Iran gets a nuclear weapon, for God's sakes. Rafsanjani famously said about Israel, it's a one bomb country. This could go very big, I think, very fast, and the consequences would be enormous. I agree, Russia would be a beneficiary, potentially. The Iranians might think they'd be a beneficiary, but they might end up being a very big loser as well, depending on how everything plays out. Because as Bill says, once this goes, it becomes very unpredictable. It's nonlinear.
The Chinese benefit from that too, right? And I assume in that world, Donald Trump winds up president, because gas goes up to $4.95 a barrel or a gallon, and that's enough.
Yeah, they're also, I can just butt in here, 2 quick points. There are also like weird, unpredictable side effects of this. Like if Iran does end up at war, then like all of a sudden it has to run a very significant repressive apparatus at home and fight a war abroad, or at least partially abroad. And those things are both very expensive. It is a notoriously hard thing to do both. So like, maybe that's the end of the Iranian regime if they get into a larger war. Maybe they just don't have the capacity to do both. Those are the kinds of things we can't really know. The other point I wanted to make is that it is worth dwelling here on the degree to which there is sort of I try not to use the word access, but there is sort of a coordination among all the worst people in the world, right? I mean, the Russians and the Chinese are partners without limits. The Russians and the Iranians are now basically co-fighting a war in Ukraine. The Iranians and their proxies, are Hamas and Hezbollah and the militias in Iraq. The Russians' proxies are, their puppet states in Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova and Belarus. And they're all friends with North Korea, and they share nuclear technology when they can. And if you were back reading Krauthammer's unipolar moment essay, it sort of seemed like, well, eventually the United States will decline and there will be a bunch of other challengers. And I think what we're starting to see is that there's sort of a bunch of other challengers, but there's sort of one competing coalition of evil, and that's really bad. I mean, that's a significantly worse situation than if all of these people hated each other as much as they hate us.
There was a phrase, to your point, Ben, that bubbled up years ago that I wrote a column on called the axis of outcasts. And what you could do was just watch who was going to the capitals and, going to Moscow, who was going to Beijing, who was going and being received in a diplomatic way by these, powers that are trying to rival the US. And every outcast regime or terrorist outfit you could possibly imagine was, part of this axis of outcasts. That's what they were doing, And I mean, it's the same thing, I documented the fall of Afghanistan, for example, and watching Taliban officials go to Moscow, and receive diplomatic approval from the Russians was quite a moment, given the whole tortuous history there in Afghanistan. But it speaks to the enduring power of this axis of outcasts. And I think that that's exactly right, that we're seeing, when you talk about Iran's fiscal constraints, they also have cut a deal with China, a more prosperous economic deal with China. Who's to say China doesn't help them out and make sure they have the resources they need to do what they need to do? So it is very much that access against America and its allies.
Hey, Tom, you follow the jihadi and associated bad guys, their writings and so forth. How much has Iran just decided, well, we killed Soleimani and took credit for it in January of 2020, I guess it was. And, we did it and they're not still looking for revenge. I mean, I worry a lot about, and I assume we're at high alert and so forth. And I, again, don't want to put I'm not putting any ideas in anyone's mind. I worry that we underestimate how much a country like that Iranian regime wants a tit for tat on that, and might regard a bunch of chaos. What if the base could get attacked with Americans on it somewhere in the region? We wouldn't be sure who might have done it. I mean, there's so much chaos going on, right? And I just wonder, again, we tend to assume that, okay, we got rid of this horrible guy, and there was a tidy little small, attempt at retaliation right then, and everyone, that's done. That was sort of chapter 3 of the book, and now we're on chapter 9, so you can't go backwards, but I'm not sure they think this chapter has ended. And I just wonder, again, Putin has shown a willingness to go into other countries and kill people. I really, I hope I'm overly worried, but I just think one can't rule these kinds of things out.
No, I think it's a fair point. I mean, look, for all the reasons you articulated and we've articulated here, nobody is this perfect strategic mastermind, right? Nobody's calculating and solving all the variables, right? But when it comes to this sort of thing, the Iranians tend to be patient. They tend to, revenge is a long arc for them. It's not something that they need to do overnight. Just as the same thing for Al Qaeda or the Taliban, or they have a very long memory when it comes to who was killed and who were their guys, So you could absolutely envision a scenario where the Soleimani brigades, for example, carry out a high profile terrorist attack that is meant to avenge his death. That's something you could very much see. I wouldn't be surprised if some sort of Soleimani loyalist contingent was involved in recent events, quite frankly, because the IRGC's hooks are very much into these groups. And that's another thing that I do not believe that the U.S. has full transparency on or really understands the extent of that. So it's another calculation here where you have to really be careful about, how much of this is really, the various actors all have a say or a vote, like you said, Bill.
Bill, one of the things you've been optimistic about over the last year and a half or so has been the Western alliance with regard to Ukraine, and that nobody could have predicted how well, first of all, how swiftly and decisively it would have come together, and secondly, how well it has hung together, with even like the Germans really reorienting their foreign policy very quickly. What are your thoughts about now? In the case of Israel, it won't be so much an alliance. They won't need the Germans and the French and the Swedes sending them weapons, but they do need sort of approval. Need is the wrong word here. Right now, general sentiment in the West seems to be, at least at the governmental level, largely on the side of Israel. How long can that hold? How long would it hold? And what does it matter? Does it matter? Does it not matter? Does it influence the broader alliance with Ukraine against Russia? What talk about that a little bit for me?
I mean, it's a good, and I'd like to hear Eric and others on this. It's a good question, obviously, and traditionally the sentiment's been decent after one of these terrorist attacks on the West, some sympathy with the victims, but then they're victims in Gaza, and it moves over time, and sometimes it can move pretty quickly. And the Israeli leaders have said in the past, we have a clock we're running against in carrying out these operations. But this is where I think this is such a huge moment. I mean, one can remember, and this is where I'm not quite as pessimist. I'm partly very worried and pessimistic, and I'm partly thinking, if we succeed, I mean, at the end of the day, if Putin fails in Ukraine, and if Hamas fails succeeded in a ghastly way already, killing Israelis, I understand. But if it fails in fundamentally destabilizing Israel or the Middle East, and fundamentally destabilizing the Arab world for that matter, if it suffers lots of losses, and maybe some people even say maybe this whole Hamas-Hezbollah way of going is not the right way to go, sort of like ISIS failed ultimately in 2015, 16, 17, you could argue, at least for a while, right? And Al-Qaeda failed. I mean, we did pummel them, and it became a less attractive option, it seems like, in many parts of the world. Those things don't last forever. You've got to keep doing that. Anyway, a long way of saying that if Putin fails and if Hamas fails, it could be a good moment. I mean, a terrible moment in terms of casualties and the suffering and the death, but it could be a moment where people look back and say, very rough few years, but actually the democracies showed they were tougher than we thought, and Zelensky showed very young democracy, fantastic leadership and fantastic spirit and courage from the people. Israel, kind of a mess and deeply split domestically, was able to pull together and do what it had to do. European nations that have been pretty anti-Israel and pretty bad.
I was going to say
levels.
Europe, not historically good.
No,
on
but what
Israel,
if there's a little bit of a turn there? You know, it has been a little surprising, the initial reaction in terms of Israeli colors on every parliament in Israel, in Europe, and on the Eiffel Tower and stuff. So that would be I'm putting it too now, having been too pessimistic, now too optimistic, I suppose. But I don't think we should fully rule out the sense that if we all can pull together, but that does require us pulling together. It requires the Biden administration doing very well, and I think it's done pretty well so far, really very well in this media crisis, and pretty well in general on these crises. But really taking as Giselle Donnelly argued in the Bulwark this morning, really going up another level in terms of taking this as a serious global confrontation, going up another level in terms of our own defense capabilities, diplomatic and intelligence capabilities, Europeans continuing to make some of those calculations.
It also
Israel
involves the
itself
Israelis
together. There's a
trying
lot
to-
that would have to happen, but maybe not out of the question.
Does it not, Eric, also involve the Israelis trying to rally the world to their side and not try to keep public opinion with them?
Yes, but I think the Israelis, JVL, are profoundly cynical about.
Yeah, no, me too, and
about-
with good reason, right?
About the international community, and I suspect a lot of the private conversations going on here. I mean, they've done a couple of things. First of all, since Operation Cast Lead in Gaza in 2007 and 8, they have a lot of effort into improving their ability to conduct urban operations. They've doctrinally talked about decisive victory. What I think that means actually is that they've got to go in, if they go in on the ground in Gaza, and get as much done as they possibly can before the international community tells them stop. And because you're killing too many, civilians. I think one of the reasons we started this conversation talking about the 6,000 missiles and bombs that have been, dropped in Gaza. I think one of the reasons you're seeing extraordinary use of ordnance is because they're trying to accomplish as much in terms of hitting the Hamas infrastructure as they can, early on. I think, again, as Eliot said on Shield of the Republic, which posted today, they're going to want to go in and kill as much of the leadership as they can, kill as many of the fighters, the frontline Hamas fighters, as they can. That's what they did in Lebanon in 2006. They used to, they were literally monitoring the obituaries in the Lebanese newspapers to try and get a sense of how many they had killed. Because Hezbollah was very good about actually, publishing, honorifics to the ones who had been fighters. So I think you're going to see that again, and I think they're going to try, as they have in the past, to avoid, civilian casualties. They leaflet, they use megaphones to tell people to get out of buildings. They do the so-called roof knocking, where they drop dummy bombs on the roof to let people know, no shit, you need to get out now. But eventually there's going to be collateral damage. There always is in this kind of conflict, and I think they will get told eventually by the U.S. and other allies, okay, now you've really got to, stop. But one thing before I kind of yield the floor back, Tom made a point earlier, and Bill talked about Giselle Donnelly's terrific piece in the Bulwark today about our defense industrial base, which really has withered since the end of the Cold War, and this is going to be a huge problem. I mean, we almost ran out of precision-guided munitions ourselves in 2015 when we were fighting the counter-ISIS campaign. We now are straining to meet the needs of the Ukrainians, and we're emptying our own larder to a degree that I think the service chiefs and combatant commanders are getting very nervous about in the Pentagon. If you look at Bill LaPlante, the Undersecretary for Acquisition, who is working very hard on this problem, if you look at his charts, which are posted on the DoD website, it's going to be a while before we get to the point where we can produce, for instance, 100,000 rounds of .155 artillery ammunition a month. 6,000 bombs in 6 days, the kinds of consumption of munitions we've seen in Ukraine, it's just dwarfing our capacity and that of our allies. And one of the things I think that has to come out of this week, it's kind of been a horrible, tragic week, but if we can get something like what Mitch McConnell proposed in the Wall Street Journal the other day, a big package with aid to Israel, aid to Ukraine, aid for Taiwan, something on the border, and really make a big investment in, increasing the capacity of the defense industrial base, it'll put us in a position to be the arsenal of democracy that I think we have to be, given the challenges Ben was describing earlier of the access of the outcasts or of the access of evil, as someone once put it.
All right. We're coming up on time here, and so I want to wrap this up. I just want to ask you guys to tell me what we'll go around the horn. What are you going to be looking for most just over the next week? So as we, start to see what's happening on the ground and get more information, maybe even get some information on what has happened, where are you keeping your eyes most in the very, very near term? So let's talk next week. Tom, I'll start with you, bud.
I'd say the smallest point I'm looking at, it's really the scope of what Israel's campaign in Gaza looks like. I mean, just that's the small ball here, not minimizing it at all, but just in terms of what the one thing that is the most measurable that we can look at to figure out what's going to happen. What exactly are they going to do in terms of launching the ground campaign? How are they going to go after Hamas? How are they going to go after Hamas assets in other countries, by the way, which we haven't really even talked about, but that's a thorny topic as well. In addition to Iran, they also have patrons in Turkey and Qatar, of course, which is another aspect of all this. And then bigger scope is this going to, widen out, not just from the Israelis' perspective, but from others' perspectives. And that's obviously probably going to go, I'd say it's probably longer than a week-long tenure, but who knows,
Ben, what are you keeping your eye on?
I want to say one thing first, is that I don't want us to get out of here without saying that the speech Joe Biden gave was fantastic. And in fact, basically everything he said so far, I think, has been...
Yeah, but don't you know how old he is, Ben?
Look, I've never heard him speak that well. And part of it was reading off a teleprompter, and part of it appeared to be him just deciding to insert a story off the cuff, and it was wonderful. And I got to say, at the same time, I'm slightly annoyed that it took him 3 hours to do that when Israel was attacked, and it's been 19 months since Ukraine was attacked, and he has not yet done it. He clearly can, so let's get to it. But no, the thing I'm going to be watching is when the Israeli emergency unity government is going to give a signal of what the goals are for this operation. Because if they step off and they haven't announced publicly what the goals are, that's just a recipe for disaster. And it doesn't need to be super specific, but they need to say, here's what we're going to accomplish. Otherwise, nobody knows.
Eric.
Well, I agree with what Ben said about the Biden speech and also the lack of one on Ukraine. I'm like Ben. I'm going to be looking at how the Israelis describe the objectives of the operation. That's going to be a very important point. And the other is the northern border. What's happening on the northern border, and is this going to spread?
I would ask you this quick follow-up. If a week from now the northern border is still basically inactive, is that a good sign? Like, do you think to yourself, okay, the longer we go without action there, the less likely action there is, or does that not really change? Is it just who knows?
I mean, look, they could go at any time, but I think, if the ground operation has started in Gaza and the Israelis are well into it and nothing is happening on the northern border, that's, I think, a good sign.
All right. Bill, you get the last word.
And everything everyone has said is important and right to focus on. I guess I will also look for the unknown unknowns, and whether bombs go off elsewhere in the world and explosions happen of either a military nature or more of a political and diplomatic nature. I mean, there's so many aspects of this. It's going to take a long time both to work out, but also even for us to process. What about Turkey as a NATO ally? And they seem to be pretty close to Hamas. Qatar, where we have, I think it's the largest American Air Force base, maybe outside the US. I don't know. It's very, very large. Certainly in the Middle East, I think. It's like 5 miles from our Air Force base. the head of Hamas is broadcasting, if I'm not mistaken, Eric, correct me, or Tom, I mean, he's broadcasting his television, appeals to terrorists to kill people. Now, I suppose that can go on for a while. The world's a complicated place. We can have military assets there, and Hamas leader could be sitting there, and it doesn't never the twain shall meet. But I don't know, the whole thing, the degree to which it's potentially an unstable situation, I guess, is what really strikes me. And I hope it's more stable than I think, because I think on the whole, most of this instability would not be for the better.
Well said. Tom Joscelyn, thank you so much for coming on this. Bill Kristol, Eric Edelman, Ben Parker, thank you guys. It's been a truly excellent show. Everybody listening in the comments, thank you guys for being your best selves too. I really appreciate that. Go listen to Shield of the Republic. New show dropped today. I have not gotten to it yet. That'll be on my Friday listen. It will make you smarter about all of this stuff. Everybody out there, just, try to be light in the world, and we'll be back here and we'll do this again on Thursday. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.